Hey guys, this is Tim Babb for AE Touch Plus, and welcome to the Advanced Jumper tutorial. So let's take a look at the advanced jumper effect that we're going to be creating. Okay, and that's pretty awesome. By the way, the actor is my buddy Delno Eby, who was kind enough to help me out. To create this effect, let's import our footage. So let's select our jumper footage and let's drop this into After Effects. Let's drop this into our workflow to create a new composition. Also, make sure that this composition is named Jumper. Now, as I move through the timeline, you can see that I have blocks of frames at different angles. What we are going to do is create a panorama. Now, there's more than one way to create a decent panorama. I'm going to show you one way. Making sure that you are on the first frame in the timeline, let's duplicate our footage and let's name our top layer to 1. Next, let's right-click on this layer and let's go to Time and Freeze Frame. Now hit the letter T to bring up the opacity for our one layer. Let's set the opacity to 50. Let's move ourselves through the timeline until just before our actor begins to run. Let's also turn on the 3D attribute for both of our layers. Now the next thing we need to do is create a new camera. So let's go to Layer and New and Camera. And let's set our camera to 50 millimeters and hit OK. Go ahead and create a new null object by going to Layer, New, and Null Object. Now go ahead and parent your camera to this null object and then turn on the 3D attribute for the null object. Let's also rename this null to Camera Control. Next, we need to select our jumper layer and let's go ahead and rename this to 2. Let's hit P to bring up its position. Now let's move our 2 layer over on the x-axis until our actor lines up. Now, I'm sure that you are noticing that there are some things not quite lining up, and that's correct. We're going to need to fix this. Let's select our layer 1, and let's add a linear wipe. So let's go to Effect, Transition, and Linear Wipe. Making sure that our angle is set to a positive, let's increase our amount so that our transition ends behind our actor. Let's also feather this out quite a bit. Now we want to turn the opacity for our one layer back up to 100%. We need to straighten things up, so let's add a Liquify Distortion by going to Effect, Distort, and Liquify. Inside our Liquify tool, we have a bunch of different tools that we can use. For our case, let's select and use the Move tool. If you hold Control down and move your mouse, you can make the area that the tool is affecting bigger or smaller. Now for our one layer, push our image around in various areas so that it begins to line up with our footage layer. Since our 2 layer will be a live action frame, we don't want to use the Liquify tool on this. So continue lining up our one layer as good as possible with our Liquify tool. Once you have this lined up like you like, go ahead and select your primary selection tool once again. Then select your null object and let's push this over so that our actor is lined up in the middle of our screen. Let's select and duplicate our 2 layer and let's name the top layer 3. This is because our 2 layer needs to be underneath our other layers for blending purposes. Next, let's select our null object and let's reposition ourselves so that we have our 2 and 3 layers centered. Now we want to move ourselves in the timeline so that we stop where our actor is in mid-jump. Okay, with our 2 layers selected, let's hit Control, Shift, D to split the layer. Let's rename the layer that occurs later to Frozen 2. Let's push this layer to the left in the timeline to where our actor is no longer on frame. Right-click on this layer and go to Time and Freeze Frame. Now we need to pull the end of this layer to where it begins when our 2 layer ends. Remember, if you hold Shift down, you can snap this into place. Now making sure that we are positioned in the timeline where our Frozen 2 layer begins, let's reposition ourselves in the timeline to where we can see that the footage has rotated and stopped in our 3 layer. Go ahead and right click on layer 3 and then go to Time and Freeze Frame. Let's change our opacity back to 50 and then hold Shift and hit P on the keyboard to bring up this layer's position as well. Let's move this layer on the x-axis to where we can see that the footage is lining up once again. With our 3 layers still selected, let's add another liquify effect. So go to Effect, Distort, and Liquify. Now go ahead and turn the opacity back up to 100 for our 3 layer. Let's also add a linear wipe. So go to Effect, Transition, and Linear Wipe. Let's change the angle to -90, and let's increase this amount a bit. For my comp, I'm going to set this to about 45 or so, but play around with the amount for your composition. Just make sure that you give your actor enough room in their jump so that they aren't cut off by this layer. Next, let's feather this by about 28. Now I'm going to select my camera control, and I'm going to set my view onto where this transition is occurring. Also, if you select one of your layers, you can use your arrow keys to reposition it a bit if needed. I'm actually going to do this for my 3 layer. It needs to come down a bit on the y-axis. Next, with my 3 layer selected, let's go into our Liquify tool and select the Move tool. Once again, push pixels around until you have things lining up in such a way that looks decent. And just know that things may never be 100% perfect, but just go ahead and at least line things up and make it flow. Next, we need to select our 2 layer and our frozen 2 layer. Let's pre-compose these by going to Layer and Pre-compose. Let's call this composition 2 Pre-comp. Let's turn on the 3D attribute, and let's also turn on our continually rasterize option. Now let's select our camera and the camera control and hit Control C on the keyboard to copy it. Next, let's open up our 2 Pre-comp by alt-clicking on it. Go ahead and hit Control V on your keyboard to paste this camera and the camera control into the composition. We did this so that we can see our layers while we work on them. Next, what I want you to do is select your 2 layer and duplicate it by hitting Control D on the keyboard. Rename the top layer to Mask, making sure that we are on the last frame for our mask and 2 layers. Select the mask layer and right-click and select Time and Freeze Frame. Move the mask layer above the frozen layer and lengthen the layer to last for the same duration as the frozen layer. Also, drag the beginning of the mask layer to begin at the same time as the frozen layer. Next, we need to select our pen tool and make sure that our mask layer is selected. Also, you'll want to position yourself in the timeline so that you are over your mask layer. If you're not over your mask layer, every time you use your pen tool, you'll simply create a shape layer even though your mask layer is selected. So once again, make sure that you are positioned over your mask layer in the timeline. In my project, I was positioned on the last frame of my 2 layer, so a simple page down will work. Once we are positioned correctly, let's start masking out our actor. Now, you don't need to take a ton of time here to make sure that the mask is super accurate, but you do want it to be fairly close. So quickly go through and outline your actor. Once this is done, create a new solid by going to Layer, New, and Solid, and name this solid to Transport. Let's position this layer to be just above our mask layer. Okay, now we need to add a fractal noise by going to Effect, Noise and Grain, and Fractal Noise. Next, set the contrast to about 290, and then change the brightness to about -20. Now, making sure that you're still at the beginning, set a keyframe for your brightness attribute. Now hit your page down key 5 times to move 5 frames over, or you can manually do this as well. And then set your brightness to 135. Change your mask layer's track matte to Luma inverted, and go back and take a look at how things are working. Another thing that we want to do is to give the illusion that our actor is still moving. So reposition yourself in the timeline to where your mask layer begins, and let's parent our transport layer to our mask layer. Now with our mask layer selected, hit P to bring up its position. Let's set a keyframe for our position, and then let's move this keyframe over to the left in the timeline a frame or 2. Now hit page down on your keyboard about 7 times, and let's change our x-axis to about -235, or really whatever looks good for you. Finally, let's grab the end of our mask layer and drag it over in the timeline so that it will end here as well. One last thing that we should do is to go ahead and delete our camera and null. Once that is done, go ahead and close out of your 2 pre-comp and let's head back to our jumper composition. Now we need to work on our shadow layer, so let's select our 2 pre-comp and duplicate it by hitting Control D on the keyboard. Let's rename the top layer to shadow, and let's move our shadow layer above our 3 layer. Okay, let's turn off our shadow layer's visibility for just a moment. Now let's move in the timeline to right before the shadow gets cut off. Let's right click on our shadow layer and go to time and freeze frame. Let's also position our shadow layer to begin on this frame as well. Let's turn our shadow layer's visibility back on, and let's turn our 3 layers visibility off. Next, go ahead and select the shadow layer and hit T to bring up its opacity. Let's set our opacity to 50 and then hold Shift and hit P to bring up the position, and then click the stopwatch on the position to set a keyframe. Let's actually turn our shadow layer's visibility back off for just a moment. Hit page down on your keyboard until the shadow disappears, and then hit page up to go back to the last frame when our shadow was in the shot. We want to drag our shadow layer to the end of this frame as well. Remember, if you hold your Shift key down, you can snap your layer into place. Let's now turn our shadow layer's visibility back on, and let's move it over on the x-axis to give our footage the feeling that the shadow has continued to move. Let's now solo our shadow layer, and let's bring up the opacity to 100. I now want to select my pen tool, and for my shot, I want to rotoscope my shadow all the way from my arms to just underneath the armpits. Next, I want to unsolo the layer and select my primary selection tool. I want to hit F to bring up my feather option, and I want to feather this out by about 10 or so. And now would be a good time to turn the visibility for our 3 layer back on. Go ahead and readjust the mask at this point if you think it needs some readjustment. Also, with the shadow layer still selected, hit P to bring up its position, and feel free to move it around so that it looks like it matches up with the rest of the shadow. Another thing that we can do to help the shadows blend together a bit is to change the transfer mode of our shadow layer to darken. Finally, making sure that our shadow layer is still selected and that we are at where this layer begins in the timeline, let's hold and hit Shift S to bring up the scale property as well. Let's set a keyframe for our scale at 100%. Next, hit page down on the keyboard until we are at where our shadow is least lining up with the footage underneath. Let's scale our shadow up just a bit. Use both your scale and your position properties until you have something that you like. Let's also move to our last position keyframe for our shadow layer. You may have noticed that because of our scale, things aren't lining up as well, but that's okay. Feel free to use your page up and page down keys to monitor how your shadows are mixing. Continue working on this until you have things pretty well lined up. Just know that this doesn't have to be 100% flaw-free, but it does need to line up well enough that the viewer's attention isn't drawn to the shadow. Once you are done with this, I want you to go to the last frame of your shadow layer. We'll want to work at this point in time, so we shouldn't move anywhere in the timeline for a little bit. As an added measure, let's add a time marker. Remember to hold Shift to snap this into place. Now we are ready for the last panel of our panoramic. So let's select our 1 layer and let's duplicate it. Let's rename the top layer to last and drop it underneath everything else. Go ahead and select all of its effects and let's delete them for now. Next, let's select our camera control and hit P to bring up its position. Let's move this over on the x-axis. Now we need to select our last layer and hit P to bring up its position. And we'll need to move this over quite a bit on the x-axis. The next thing that we need to do is right-click on the last layer and go to Time, and let's remove Time Remapping by going to Time and uncheck Time Remap. Let's then move this layer over in the timeline to where things are starting to match up. And let's actually solo this layer for a moment. We actually want to set this to right before our actor jumps. Now we need to solo our 3 layer as well. Hit T to bring up our 3 layers opacity, and let's drop this to 50. Reselect the layer named last, and with your arrow keys, go ahead and line this up with our 3 layer. We can also zoom in our view to help out a bit. Now we need to unsolo both layers and turn the opacity for our 3 layer back to 100. And with our last layer selected, let's hit Control, Shift D to split the layer. Now hit page up one time on the keyboard and let's solo our last layer that occurs first in the timeline. This should be the layer all the way at the bottom. Let's move this layer over to where our actor is standing still. Now we can freeze the time for this layer, but I don't want to lose the grain. We're going to have 3 versions of this layer occurring at the same time, and this layer will only be visible in the background while the other layer is appearing. So an easy way to match grain is to allow the footage to be visible. So to do this, we want to push the layer over far enough to where we can see that our actor is generally in the same area for the duration of the preceding layer. Now, let's set this layer to end at the same time of our top last layer. Let's also set this to begin at the same time by positioning ourselves in the timeline to where we are at the beginning of our preceding last layer. With our last layer selected, let's hit Control Shift D to split this layer. Now, delete the very bottom layer. Let's rename the bottom layer to background, and then let's rename our top layer to area. Now, let's also set both our area and background layers to both being soloed. And now, making sure that we are in the timeline at where we set our marker, let's reposition ourselves to exactly 10 frames prior to this point. We can do this by hitting page up 10 times, or we can manually change our seconds by clicking on the time and editing it this way as well. Now, I want you to duplicate the area layer by selecting it and hitting Control D on the keyboard. Position the new area layer to be between the area and the background layers and rename this layer to whole. And I'm going to reposition this layer to where my actor has just landed. Now, I want to drag the beginning of the background layer to line up with the beginning of my whole layer. What we are going to do is mask out a hole in our whole layer and fill it with our background layer. So to do this, we need to select our pen tool and let's draw a nice big area around our crouching actor. Once we have done this, we need to change our mask to subtract. So with our whole layer selected, let's hit MM on the keyboard to bring up our mask properties, and let's change our mask to subtract. Now let's move ourselves in the timeline to where our actor is in mid-jump and right before he starts to descend. Let's create a new solid by going to Layer, New, and Solid, and let's name this layer Reveal. Let's drop this to be just above our area layer. And now we need to add a fractal noise to our solid. So let's go to Effect, Noise and Grain, and Fractal Noise. Now let's make some changes to our fractal noise. Let's set the contrast to 285. Let's set a keyframe for the brightness at 0. At this time, go ahead and hit your page down option 4 times to move 4 frames later in the timeline. Go ahead and change the brightness to 140. We also need to set the area layer's track matte to lumen matte. Finally, we need to make our solid a 3D layer. So let's toggle that option on. But in order for this to work, we need to set its position coordinates to line up with our area layer. So select the area layer and hit P to bring up its position. Copy the position for our area layer by selecting it and hitting Control C on the keyboard. Then let's paste this to our reveal layer by selecting this layer and hitting Control B on the keyboard. Now let's set our reveal layer to line up with our area layer in the timeline. So hold Shift down and let's snap our position back to the beginning of our area layer. Let's set our reveal layer to begin at this point in time as well. Now set the end of the solid to end at the same time that our area layer ends too. Next, we need to line things up. So let's unsolo all of our layers and then let's select our reveal, area, whole, and background layers. And let's pre-compose these by going to Layer and Pre-compose. Let's move all attributes and let's name this new comp Appear Pre-comp. Let's turn on this layer's 3D switch and let's also turn on the Continually Rasterize option. What we need to do next is to select our 3 layer and duplicate the linear wipe by hitting Control D. Then let's click on Reset for the new linear wipe. Let's move our transition over a bit. And then once again, let's feather this by about 30. Let's select our 3 layer and let's hit T to bring up its opacity and set this to about 50. Let's select our Appear Pre-Comp. Let's also scale it up just a bit. Hit S on the keyboard to bring up its scale properties, and let's scale this to about 103. Once we have something that we like, let's turn our 3 layers opacity back up to 100%. Now let's go back into our 3 layer and select the Liquify tool. And once again, set this to the Move tool. Now we can work on our building, and in particular our rooftop, so that we can have a nice overall transition. We want to avoid as much as possible the feeling that things are being warped. While the viewer's main attention will be on the actor, we need to try and do a good enough job on matching things up so that the viewers don't become distracted with the background. So once again, we need to use our Move tool to create a nice transition across our 3 layer and to match it up to both layers on each side of it. Once you have completed this, select the camera control and let's position ourselves onto our actor. We should line this up so that our actor is just to the left of the middle of the shot. Let's position ourselves in the timeline to just before he starts to run. And let's set a keyframe for our camera control's position. Let's move through the timeline and over as well to where our actor has landed and is beginning to stand up. Let's make sure that he has already landed and is standing up for our final keyframe. Also, delete any other keyframes that you may have from repositioning your view. Now select both keyframes and hit F9 for easy ease, or right click and go to Keyframe Assistant and Easy Ease. Let's move in the timeline to where our actor has just about fully stood up and hit the letter N on the keyboard. Then move to the very beginning keyframe and hit B on the keyboard. Let's right click on our time bar and select Trim Comp to work area. Another thing that I have noticed is that my first and last frames are a little dark. So let's take a look at layer 1. Let's add a curves effect by selecting this layer and going to Effect, Color Correction, and Curves. Now go ahead and boost your brights a bit. Now let's go to the last frame in the comp and select the Appear Pre-Comp. Add a curves effect by going to Effect, Color Correction, and Curves. And once again, let's boost our brights a bit and match up our brightness so that the frames blend together. Let's also take a quick look at matching things up a little better with our camera. If we move in the timeline where our actor is in mid-jump and just about to land, we may have some timing issues. So to fix this, let's grab our last keyframe and move it in a bit until our actor is once again in frame. Now let's do some quick overall color correction. Let's select all of our layers. Let's pre-compose these by going to Layer and Pre-Compose. And call this new comp Panorama or something of that nature. Let's add a curves effect by going to Effect, Color Correction, and Curves. And let's add a nice bright contrast curve. Let's add a tint effect by going to Effect, Color Correction, and Tint. Let's set our tint to about 30. Let's add a solid by going to Layer, New, and Solid, and let's create a bright orange and yellowish solid. Let's change the opacity to 30 and set the transfer mode to overlay. Let's also create an adjustment layer by going to Layer, New, and Adjustment Layer. Let's add a directional blur by going to Effect, Blur and Sharpen, and Directional Blur. Change the direction to 90, and let's set a keyframe for frame 1 for 0 blur. Go to 1 second in the timeline and let's change the blur to about 8. Next, let's go to where our actor is just appearing and let's set another keyframe for our blur at 8. Let's then go out a little bit farther and then let's change our blur back to 0. We're just about finished, but I want to add a couple more quick effects to accentuate our jump effect. So let's grab our jumper comp in the outliner and let's drag this onto our Make New Comp icon. And let's name this new comp to Render. Let's select our jumper comp and let's scale this up just a bit to hide any imperfections on our edges. So select this layer and hit S on the keyboard, and let's scale this to about 105. We don't want to scale it up too much or we'll lose a little too much quality, but if we scale it up just a bit, this will be okay. Next, we need to duplicate our jumper layer by selecting it and hitting Control D on the keyboard. Let's move in the timeline to our actor is just getting into the air. Let's select our top layer, and we want to make this layer begin at this point in time. Now, we need to select our pen tool, and let's draw a garbage mask around our actor. When you're done with this, I want you to select your primary selection tool. All right, before we move forward, let's check out the timing of things. So let's do a RAM preview. And we actually are having a timing issue. So let's go ahead and stop our RAM preview. And as you can see, we still have our actor visible here on the ground and then visible here too. And we don't want that. So let's go into our jumper comp and let's go into our panorama comp. Let's select our camera and camera control. And let's copy these by hitting Control C on the keyboard. Let's go into our appear pre-comp. Let's Control V, paste in our camera and camera control. Let's also drag these into view. As you can see, our actor is visible here. And let's hit page down a few times until we see our actor up in the air. Let's go ahead and set our area layer to begin at this time. Let's also drag our reveal layer to begin here as well. Now let's go back into our panorama comp and let's drag our appear pre-comp over just a little bit in the timeline to help give our actor a moment before reappearing. And now let's go into our render comp and let's do another RAM preview. And that's looking a lot better. And so let's return back to our beginning frame and let's select our top jumper layer. Now hit MM on your keyboard. First off, let's set our feather to about 200. And now I want to set a keyframe for our mask path. Now move forward in the time to where our actor reappears and set the mask to be over this area. Go a ways out again and recenter the mask once again on our actor. Now, if you're wondering why we are doing this since both of these layers are the same, well, this is because we are going to add some effects to our top layer that we don't want on the rest of the footage. Now, we need to reposition ourselves in the timeline so that we are at where our top layer begins. Next, we need to add a CC light rays effect to our top layer. So with this layer selected, let's go to Effect, Generate, and CC light rays. Let's set a keyframe of 0 for intensity, and let's position our center onto our actor, and let's set a keyframe for this as well. I also want to add a CC vector blur, so go to Effect, Blur and Sharpen, and CC vector blur. And once again, set a keyframe for the amount at 0. Finally, hold down your Shift key and hit T to bring up our opacity. And let's set the opacity to 0 and set a keyframe for this. Let's reposition ourselves in the timeline to right before our actor disappears, and let's change our opacity to 80. Next, let's change our CC light rays amount to 200 and reposition the center to be on top of the actor. Let's also turn our warp softness down to 0 and then play around with your radius to get a look that feels right for your shot. You'll likely want to take this over 100 up to 150 or maybe even a little more. Next, we want to turn our CC vector blur up to about 85 or so. Another thing that you can do for some different looks is to play around with the positioning of your center for your CC light rays. I think it looks better if you keep it just a bit in front of your actor or right on him. Now, we want to hit our page down key about 4 times. Let's change our opacity to 0 and our CC light rays intensity to 0. At this last keyframe, we also want to make sure that our mask path has our mask centered on where our actor was. The last thing that we want to do before moving ahead is to reposition the center of our CC light rays to be where our actor was before he disappeared. Now let's reposition ourselves to our actor has just appeared. Let's then hit our page up key about 3 times. Let's position our mask to be where our actor is appearing. Let's set keyframes for the current values for our CC light rays intensity and our layer's opacity. Let's reposition the CC light ray center to be on where our actor will be reappearing. Let's hit our page down key about 3 times. Let's turn our CC light rays intensity up to 200, and let's also turn our opacity back up to about 60. Let's hit our page down key about 5 times, and let's turn our opacity back to 0 and our CC light rays intensity back down to 0 as well. Alright guys, and there you have it. We have just completed the advanced jumper effect. Well, I hope you had fun, and thanks for watching.